So I've got a bit of maybe a controversial kind of opinion on students and the way they study that I've noticed over the past decade that I've been studying. What I've noticed is that pretty much 80% of what most students do is a waste of time. Not a waste of time, but pretty much getting them nowhere. Because here's a scenario I was always very familiar with. I would study a subject very, very hard, and I'd feel like I understood the concepts very, very well. I felt like I understood, the chapters very well. And I would sit in the exam, I would understand the concepts of the questions, but I couldn't do any of them. So essentially all my study time was a complete waste of time. Even though I understood the concepts, I didn't know what was going on. And this is because students, they study hard, they focus hard, me too, but on the wrong things. Because this is what I want to help you realize in this video, that you're probably studying and focusing on a lot of the wrong things. And if you instead move your attention to the correct things, you can significantly reduce how much you need to study and save a ton of time and actually get better results from doing it. And this is not a joke. I'll get into it. Basically, there's this book called The 4-Hour Workweek, and it talks about the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So the quote here is, effectiveness is doing the things that get you closer to your goals. Efficiency is performing a given task in the most economical manner possible. So what this means is usually students are pretty efficient. They study hard, they focus hard, they do the work, but they're not effective. They don't do the work that will actually get them to higher grades. So I like to think of it as like a boat. Rowing really hard on your boat is one thing, but if you're rowing really hard on a rowboat, it's gonna make you slower than if you row really hard on a speedboat. So it's not about just rowing really, really hard, it's about being on the correct boat. And I'm not just gonna talk about study tips, do this, do this, do this. I'm gonna talk about where to actually put your attention when you're sitting down to study for your exam or do your assignment. From what I've noticed over the years, observing top students, and what I've found through my own experimentation. So the first thing I can tell you is there's this thing called the 80-20 principle. Basically what it means is, in any given thing, 80% of the results will come from 20% of the efforts. So for example, in a business, 80% of the complaints will come from 20% of the customers. 80% of the income will come from 20% of the customers. 20% of the people in your life will cause you 80% of your stress. So we can apply this rule in subjects as well. 20% of a subject will give you 80% of the results in the exam. Now, how is this possible? How is it possible for 1/5 of the subject to get you 80% in the exam? Is it actually like that? I've thought about this for a while, and I don't think it's exactly 80-20. It might be 30-70, 40-60, but the principle still applies, where basically a very small amount of the subject will give you proportionally large results in the exam. Let me give you an example. For many of my subjects, there would always be this one very, very chunky question, which was worth 1/3 of the exam. And that chunky question was always on one lecture. So the subject would have 36 lectures, and one lecture would be worth 1/3 of the exam. There was another subject I did called declarative programming, where basically the exam was only on the first 6 weeks of the subject. And the last 6 weeks of the subject weren't even on the exam. So students in my class were wasting their time learning the last 6 weeks of the subject. And I did a big brain move, and I noticed that those topics weren't actually on the exam. So I skipped them completely. I saved hours of my life, and I got better results because I could focus my energy on those topics that were actually on the exam. And these students were wasting their energy on topics that weren't on the exam. So that's exactly how you figure out the 20%. You look at the assessment, you look at the exam, and you look at what topics are actually on the exam. You're gonna notice that some topics, more specifically some lectures, are gonna be worth a much larger percent than other lectures, than other topics. So this is the thing, students have it the wrong way around. They start with chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3, then chapter 4, then chapter 5, then they jump into the past papers. But this is the opposite of the 80-20 rule. This is focusing your attention very thinly. Instead, you want to focus your attention on those few topics that are going to be worth the most on the exam. So you do that by doing it in the opposite way. You start with the exam, the past paper, and you take it topic by topic. Okay, so question 1 is worth 20%, and I notice that this is on every single exam. So I'm going to study this topic and just enough to be able to do this question. Because usually what I've noticed in subjects is topics are usually an entire chapter long, but only a very small section of the topic can actually be examined on the questions. So instead of studying the entire chapter, look at the question and study just enough to be able to do the question. Or let's say, for example, you have an assignment. I would have like a coding assignment, let's say for example. And to prepare for the coding assignment, I would do like all the lectures, I'd, study all the material, made sure I understood it well, and then jumped into the assignment. But then what I started doing was I started beginning with the assignment, looking at the assignment and taking it step by step, and revising only what I needed to know to actually be able to do each question of the assignment. Bro, I don't know if this video is any good. It seems pretty vague. But anyway, now you might think, okay, bro, what if I miss some sections? What if that section I didn't study is on the exam? That's 100% true. If you focus your attention only on a few topics, you might miss a topic that's on the exam. But the point is, we want to start with those high leverage topics. You start with the topics that are going to be worth more in the exam. You understand those deeply, and then you can spread onto the other topics. But if you prioritize understanding deeply the things that are actually going to be assessed, that's going to get you the highest mark. Because here's the problem. I've noticed that many people have this thing called like an any benefit mindset, where if something gives you a benefit, they're going to do it. For example, to be honest, I'd say like 80% of the subjects in university, I didn't even go to the lectures. I just kind of studied the material on my own because I realized that I could actually study way better if I did it on my own. But I would ask the students around me, and I'd be like, hey guys, why are you guys going to the lectures? At least for some subjects, the lecture notes was so good that you didn't need to go to the lectures. And they would tell me, oh bro, like, what if I miss something in the lecture that's going to be on the exam? Sure, like the lectures suck, but at least I'm getting something out of them. This is the any benefit mindset, where basically just because the lecture has some tiny benefit, they're going to do it. But what they don't realize is that if they spent that hour studying on their own, they would get way better marks than if they spent that hour in the lecture. Now, I'm not trying to convince you here to skip your lectures. I'm just telling you to, instead of look for any kind of benefit something will give you, ask yourself if there's a way to get a better benefit. So one thing students will do is they'll like do every single practice question in the textbook, question 1, question 2, question 3. But I've noticed that most of the practice questions in the textbook are very, very easy, and they're not even relevant to the exam. So the better thing to do would be to just focus on a couple questions that are actually harder and are exam type questions, or to just go straight to the past paper and do past paper questions. So the any benefit mindset here will be like, okay, I don't want to skip this section because it might be on the exam. I don't want to skip this section because it might be on the exam. Okay, sure, it might be on the exam, but this other section is definitely going to be on the exam, and it's going to be worth the most. So just focus your energy there first, and then you can spread your energy thin. So what I'm basically telling you is to take the opposite approach to what most students take. Start with the actual exam past papers and work backwards from there. Learn just what you need to do those past papers. Learn just what you need to do the projects. So if you start with the end in mind, so you study knowing that you've got a problem to solve in your project, knowing that you've got a problem to solve in your exam, you're kind of like a hunter. So you're not just kind of mindlessly reading the textbook. Now you're reading the textbook, you're watching the lectures with a goal in mind. You've got a goal of figuring out just enough to do the assignment. You've got the goal of figuring out just enough to do the question that you read on the past paper. So if you learn like a hunter, it's much better. Like, there's this advice I always hear when it comes to like, if you want to start your own business. Basically, the advice is just to start. When you start your business, you'll realize what you need to know. And so when you actually learn and research about business, it makes it much easier to actually absorb the knowledge because you've got a problem in the back of your mind that you're trying to solve. So study with a problem in the back of your mind. So an assignment or a past paper you're doing. Like with the coding subjects I used to do, I would start with the project in mind. I would have kind of like the specification in my head, and then I would jump into the study material and learn just enough to be able to do the questions. And if you learn through that way, it's going to stick much better because you're actually applying what you learn. Like they did this study where basically they took a group of students. Okay, so I think that the study was like this. They had one group of students, basically on one day they studied, then on the next day they studied, then on the next day they studied, and then the next day they studied. And then they had another group where they studied, and then tested themselves. And they had a final group of students who studied, tested. And the very interesting thing they found was that actually the group that just did tests did much better than the group that just studied. And actually the group that just studied felt way more confident than the group that just tested. Because the group that just studied and then tested, especially in those first rounds of tests, they were getting everything wrong. So it was essentially destroying their confidence. But what they found through this study is that actually getting questions wrong actually helps you a lot. So even if you're doing practice papers, even if you're doing questions and you're getting them all wrong, as long as you're looking at the answers, you're actually learning. So in a weird way, testing actually helps you study better than actually studying. So of course you need to do a bit of study to be able to answer the questions, but the sooner you can jump into questions, the better, basically. So even if you're getting the questions wrong, it might tank your motivation. It might make you feel very unconfident if you're getting all these questions wrong. You need to realize that you're actually learning. So sometimes I will study material over and over and over and over again, and I would become very, very confident in it. I would feel like I understood the material very, very well. But then when I actually got to the exam, I couldn't answer the questions because it was kind of like a false sense of confidence that reading the material over and over again was giving me. Until you actually jump into the questions, you really don't know how you're gonna do. I realized something about like the top students. They don't really feel good, too stressed going into exams if they feel confident about it. So basically what I realized is if you've done a ton of practice questions, it boosts your confidence because you actually know that you're gonna do well on the exam. Because if you just study the material over and over again and you just learn the concepts over and over again, you don't really know if you're prepared for the exam type questions. Because there's this book I read recently called Ultra Learning by Scott H. Young. And one of the principles of ultra learning, which is learning very, very fast, is the principle of directness. So basically you need direct experience with the thing you're trying to learn, or you're not going to be able to learn it. So basically what it says is just because you understand a concept very, very well doesn't mean you're actually able to apply it. Like just because you've memorized a ton of vocabulary and grammar in a language doesn't mean you're going to understand the language when you hear it. So what you need direct experience as fast as possible. So the direct experience in this case is doing assignments, doing tests. The sooner you can do assignments and tests, that's when you can get the direct experience and you can actually learn the skills required rather than just like memorizing and learning the concepts. Like the big flaw students do is they go, okay, I'll do the past paper and the assignment when I'm ready. First I'll learn the material very, very well, and then I'll go do tests. I'll do tests to, practice a bit for the exam. But this is the completely wrong way around. It's kind of like that guy who like spends hundreds of hours researching how to lift weights before he actually steps into the gym. The way you improve lifting weights is by stepping into the gym and lifting weights. Because you can watch 100 videos on how to bench press. The first time you actually get under the bar, you're gonna struggle. Because until you actually get direct experience, you can't start improving really. So the sooner you can jump into questions, the sooner you can actually like start adjusting and start learning the actual skills, the actual intuition required to answer the questions, which is what's gonna be on the exam, which is what's gonna be on the assignments. Like I remember there was this subject, physics 2. The concepts in the lecture slides were super, super, super difficult. Like I was struggling to understand it. It was like these advanced like electromagnetic concepts and stuff. I had no idea what was going on. Then I just was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna do a past paper. And I did a past paper. I got pretty much like most questions wrong. But then I was like, fuck it, I'll do another past paper. And that next paper, I actually did like 80%. I did pretty well. What I found was that all the papers were kind of repeating the same kind of questions over and over and over again. So I'd spent like, dozens of hours trying to understand the lecture slides, but I did one past paper and it boosted my grade by like 30% just from doing one paper. So sure, you might not get lucky all the time. Sometimes, the past papers won't be this repetitive. But the point is when you start getting questions wrong, when you start answering questions, that's when you actually start learning. That's when you get better at doing past papers, which is actually what's gonna be in the assessment hall. And once you figured out the 20% of things, the few things that you're gonna focus your efforts onto, now it's about focusing. It's about actually sitting down and putting your attention towards it without being distracted, without daydreaming. And I talk about this in many of my other videos, developing a deep work habit. But if you want my personal help to help you develop a deep work habit, to help you figure out what to study, to keep you accountable so you don't waste hours a day procrastinating, so you actually develop this habit deeply into your life, then check out the first link in the description. I can help you very intensely with it, keep you accountable and everything. See you later.